I mean, our job in education, whether you're the teacher in the classroom or you're the administrator on the campus or you're the superintendent or a school board trustee, is student outcomes. And so if you're missing that, if you're not giving those children the supports that they need to be successful as students, you're failing them.
Hello, everybody. This is Jess from 3D Learning Experts, and you're listening to the LD Experts Podcast, the show for busy parents who want to help their kids with learning disabilities, or as I like to say, learning differences, go from surviving to thriving. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to have a just nice conversation with Jean Mayer, who is advocate, mentor, podcast co-host of the Moms Talk Autism and public servant. Welcome, Jean.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I did an episode at one point talking about some of the problems that happen is that once you get the autism diagnosis, they'll act like it's the catch-all for everything. And that can be, even from a clinician standpoint, because that was why they missed my son's ADHD, right? Because all of those providers that are supporting him for autism, and I'm explaining these other behaviors that are nuanced with what I feel like different things, like shaped by different things environmentally and just his expression of them. And that I felt like it was because everybody had like such tunnel vision for that. They can get so pigeonholed by that one because there's so many things inside of autism, being that the way that it analyzes all the three different domains. And so it's easy for that to fall into there. And they can even, especially if you're familiar with ABA at all, the BCBA can rationalize that behavior as, oh, well, that's autistic behavior. Well, no, it's not. Like his eloping that he was experiencing was not a condition or symptomatic of his autism for my son. It was definitely more so it was definitely ADHD, because it was the impulse control. And I know that a lot of times they will try to fit that into the autism criteria, but it was really his ability, he couldn't regulate that impulse. There was only A and B, nothing in between. So I wasn't wrong, but I was suffering for 9 months to a year because we couldn't get anybody from school, any of the educational team or our private healthcare team out until I got to my neurology appointment. He goes, "Oh my gosh, Mrs. Mayer, like I told you I sensed potential ADHD, but I was reluctant to give that diagnosis. But now here I see, this is definitely ADHD and we need to do something to help him control this impulse control." And then boom, and why he was reluctant to do medication for my child at such a young age, we had a safety and security concern for him because, and he said, medication is a tool. It's not a solution. But I will tell you that tool gave me and him a new lease on life. We were able to optimize, obviously, his learning experience because he could control his impulses more. He could pay attention, be more attentive. And then we could drive in the car for, because it was even a challenge to drive in the car safely for 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
He was eloping out of the house 18 to 20 times a day. There was so many struggles. And it was just because once his brain had decided that's what he was going to do, there was nothing to inhibit that. They needed to slow down. We needed to slow down his impulse responses in order for it to give time to be able to have that space and agency to think about, if I do this, this is what's going to happen, and it was, but I was struggling for all that time, and it was scary. And you become wired. Your own nervous system gets rewired as a parent when you're constantly living in that fight or flight
mode.
Right. But what's so interesting again was that every time I was going to, talking about this to the teams, they were like, "Oh, no, that's just, autism." And they would try to make modifications in his educational plans and his treatment plans to modify the behavior. But no matter what we did, that wasn't going to stop what was happening inside of here from a neurobiology standpoint. So we needed to have another tool, unfortunately. And then in Texas, they've now moved from dyslexia from a 504 to the option of parents, if And obviously also with the teen educational teams, if it's determined that the child needs an IEP, because what they were noticing obviously is that children needed more educational supports beyond what a 504 was able to support.
Are they not calling them ARDs anymore in
They
Texas?
do. Yeah.
So when my kids were diagnosed in Texas, they didn't have 504s. They got special ed services, and they were pulled out of class during their language arts time to go with a dyslexia specialist.
Right.
But they don't do that in every school or in every school district, which I was unaware of until I started doing my podcast and interviewing other people in Texas.
Right. And they saw that disparity is what has rolled out to where we are now. And so there was mandates that obviously came that were unfunded, which was part of the issue. All the districts, which is great. There's a good and a bad. Both things are true. More kids are getting identified now. We've doubled the amount of assessments that are being done, like literally, where even from year to year, from last year to this year, 400, we had 800 this year. I bet you next year it could possibly be double that, this 800. So it's happening, but in that mandate, they'd also was going to have the requirement that you were going to have a full special ed certification, because if you are supporting a child through an IEP, but then the commissioner has now waived that. Now we have other problems with now that through the funding weights, it was a dyslexia had a certain code. Well, now the code assignment is changing. Well, that's causing a delta now in funding. So now why they are by law going to have to be provided these services and we're going to have to do these supports. There's on average from what we're seeing when districts in our region and in a couple other districts outside of what we have their numbers are on losing about 1,000 to 1,300 per student for funding for dyslexia student. It's insane.
Well, and that is why since 1978, the public education system has tried to push dyslexia under the rug, because when 20% of your population have this challenge, it is more, costly. And that's exactly, most of the research in America that was done on dyslexia was done by the public education system. And
oh, really?
Yeah. I learned this when I went through my dyslexia certification. And so back in the day, they could hide that information. But now with the internet, they can't hide it anymore. And parents are, becoming smart to these things and being able to be better advocates for their children. And that's why after 40 years, they can't avoid it anymore.
They can't, but it's also underserving our kids and their outcomes. And as you know, their challenges, if they are dyslexia or they have dysgraphia or dyscalculia or even autism, let's say their autism isn't as such a profound, visible nature on paper or even socially, any of those things, it could be in those younger years. But as the demands and expectations increase in education, then it starts to expose itself more. But then all of a sudden we had this kid that was doing, sometimes very, very well. All of a sudden it's crashing and burning. It's because they found ways, because those teachers in those classrooms are equipped with certain levels of intervention without it going to as far as this child may not need a full assessment right now. We have something that can support them at this time without having to go through those measures. Those tools are in their toolbox, but I'm looking at that as that can be a Band-Aid to a problem that should have been identified probably earlier on for a child that probably was going to need longer term services and more built-in supports and probably things that just were missed. And our job in education, whether you're the teacher in the classroom or you're the administrator on the campus or you're the superintendent or a school board trustee, is student outcomes. And so if you're missing that, if you're not giving those children the supports that they need to be successful as students, you're failing them. So, but it's hard to do that. It's hard to meet those needs and that goal when you don't have the proper funding to do so either. So it's almost like I hate using the word hate, but I despise when they identify and they've feel like they're correcting the problem, but they're only correcting part of the problem that only bleeds out into other problems. Okay, so now you have these laws in place. Now you're saying, now we're putting processes in place. It's almost like you've fixed one area, but you've broken other areas now without looking at something holistically. And it's very frustrating, especially when you're saying the data has been there. This isn't a new thing. No. We shouldn't even be reacting reactively to these problems right now. If we've identified what the problem is, we should be able to be putting things in place that properly supports the kids and the systems that they're at.
Well, they could teach all students using an Orton-Gillingham type of system in the early years, and then there might not even be the foundational issues, and it wouldn't cost them anything extra.
That is a very interesting point. I've learned more about that. So I learned later in life that I'm dyslexic, and my dyslexia certainly was not identified through the school system. I was in public school until 3rd grade, 4th grade. My parents moved me over to private. And as that demand increased even more, I was definitely having challenges in certain grade levels in public school, but they would just either give me tutoring. And I also think the curriculum was different, which is what I wanted to circle back to, because what I think what you're saying is I'm in agreement with, because I had certain foundational tools that I had, and the way that I learned at that time served me well, so that I didn't need those additional supports at that time until obviously demands had increased. By the time I got into high school, I was really, really struggling, and because it was private, there's no educational plan. So you're working with my school advisors and stuff like that to try to figure out how can we kind of curate or individualize something that's going to best support Jean in that circumstance. But it was without naming actually what the problem was. It was treating the symptom, but not actually looking at what it was. And so I had to find my own ways to cope as an adult, and even in high school mainly, to figure out. So I would say, because everything with, whether you have dyslexia, you have ADHD, whether you're autistic, it's all a spectrum, right? So it's all a spectrum. So I would say that wherever I fall on the dyslexia spectrum, I was able to get by, but that was also because of, I learned to read through something that was available at the time in public school. That was how all kids were being taught to read, which was through the PAL system. And when I learned with the PAL system, when I was showing some of our dyslexia teachers what the PAL system was, and some of our other special ed systems, they pulled up some of what is dyslexia curriculum and showed me and said, well, this is why this worked for you. Right. But now the way that my daughter has learned how to read, and she's a typical learner, I would have never learned to read the way that my kids are taught now. And
it does not work for a dyslexic learner.
There's just no way. I would not be. I mean, she's thriving in it, and obviously we can see that. But I do think that curriculum does then, it makes it very apparent it makes it much more apparent. It indicates the learners that are different, for sure, at that point. And you can probably catch them sooner now as a result. Because I think I don't know if you hear this. I hear it all the time with autism. It's like, well, autism wasn't diagnosed as much as it is now. This is an epidemic. And no, it's that we have tools now. We also have an awareness now that we didn't have before. Would you say 100%. The same thing goes with dyslexia?
Yeah, because I spent 10 years trying to find out why my daughter couldn't do things in preschool. So I was a preschool teacher, and I knew she didn't do things that other kids did. And it wasn't until we moved to Texas 10 years later that my daughter we literally were there 1 week, and her teacher said, oh, she's dyslexic. And I said, oh, that makes sense. My mom's dyslexic. So the teacher was educated as to what dyslexia looked like. And so she could identify it quickly, where all along, we were really good friends with my daughter's 2nd grade teacher. And she said, oh, other kids are worse than her. Well, I now know she was referring to her ADHD, not to her dyslexia. But because that was in a different state and she had no clue what dyslexia looked like. My mother, who was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 40s, who was a teacher, said to me when I became a dyslexia specialist, she's like, oh, I only had a handful of kids who had dyslexia. I'm like, Mom, that's impossible. You are an art teacher. That means all of the dyslexic kids were flocking to you. But she didn't know what it looked like in anyone other than herself. She couldn't identify me as dyslexic. I did not learn to read until I was 10. I remember like for when I had the eye exam as a child, I had to like identify the pictures because I could not identify the letters. That should have been an indicator that there was something going on, but these people didn't know. The doctors didn't know. My mother, who was a teacher, didn't know. They didn't know what the characteristics of dyslexia look like. And now I can diagnose, not officially, but I can determine dyslexia within listening to a parent talk to me for 15 minutes usually, because I know what dyslexia is. But it took me 10 years to figure it out for my daughter, and I didn't figure it out on my own. So absolutely, if people know what it is, then it's very easy to spot, and they don't need to be in third grade, which is when they do the testing, or at least when they did do the testing when my kids were in Texas.
They're doing it younger now. There's a lot of kids that are being identified in first grade. I feel like there's still reluctancy in kindergarten, but the TEKS have more demand. There's more screeners and stuff that are happening and required. So some, I think, are starting to identify that in kindergarten, but I feel like they still are reluctant to do it. They're like, they'll look at, because my own daughter, because I am dyslexic, and I was watching some of her writing patterns, I was like, well, I want to keep an eye on this, right? Want to see if there's some things like, again, the inverting some of the letters that can be still considered typically developing within that time frame. I was like, if this doesn't correct itself, I'm going to say that I'm worried about, and I was also like paying attention to some of her speech patterns too. But she's gifted, and so far, those things have corrected themselves, and she is, for her age, what I would consider a prolific writer. Her writing skills, her organizing and programming skills are they're pretty. She's pretty high functioning in that area. So what they had projected for her has panned out. But for me, I already had my flags raised because I already had one neurodivergent kid. Chances are I would have another one.
Right.
That's not uncommon. And if both, their dad and myself have neurodivergence, where he's ADHD, where we do believe that he's also autistic. He's just not professionally diagnosed as autistic. Mm-hmm. Why would we not? But so for my daughter, she's technically what I would call the only normal person in the bunch, if you want to define what normal is. But at this point, I think, again, neurodivergence has been around forever.
Right. Absolutely.
We didn't have a name for it, and we didn't accept it, or we rejected it, or we were forced into fixing or compliancy and all of that stuff to just try to look like we were in tow with the rest of the world, I guess.
Well, like they say, how do you know Albert Einstein was dyslexic? Because that was before they labeled dyslexia. Well, if you know what dyslexia is, his characteristic filled, that bill. And same with Leonardo da Vinci and things like that, so what you can look back at the past, even though we didn't have an official diagnosis, and know that those neurodiversities were present way before we had a label for them.
Right. Yeah, no. And autism is because I work with, right, do a lot of mentorship, and I also work with Texas Parent to Parent doing medical training for first and second year residents on what it's like to be a medical mom. And even during when I was getting trained to be in that program to do those presentations, and parents were telling their stories, and they're just the long they could fill a page with what their child's diagnoses are, and they're, especially the older the child was, because you may start out here, but as time goes on, there's other diagnoses that go along that are identified, and so just even stepping into that world at that time, my kid being young, he didn't have those multiple diagnoses yet beyond a speech delay and autism. And I knew what was coming. And it's more likely, my neurologist had shared when I say my neurologist, my child's neurologist had shared with me, is that it is more common to be these combined typed brains than just being strictly only autism or only ADHD or dyslexic. Those things all usually go together. You normally find them running in tandem with each other than separate, right. For sure.
Yeah. Well, my youngest son has 8 neurodiversities, and not all of them have been officially diagnosed. But like you said, I, as a mother, can observe these different characteristics that have come together. And because this has been my career for the last 10 plus years, I can really see it more so than a parent who is new to it. So he wasn't officially diagnosed with autism. And I think part of that is California avoids officially diagnosing autism because California has to pay to support autistic individuals. So I think they're in cahoots with Kaiser not to readily diagnose it. And so he was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder. And so now I found a program for adults with autism, but it's way too expensive without getting the government assistance. So he can't do that program. And he's not as severe as some of the individuals at that program. However, we were able to get him into a TAP program, which is a grant that school got, and it's open to anyone who's on the spectrum. So, this place that specializes in helping autistic people has accepted my son as being autistic, and he's been working there for them since August of this year. So he's receiving some of the benefits because he's getting work experience and at a place that's for autistic people. But he's not getting the full breast of what their program offers.
With the full wraparound services that they can offer.
Yeah.
That is, it is interesting because California being like, if you have to have a disability or your child is autistic, because I almost moved there, and Brittany is, one of the moms from my podcast lives there. From a state services standpoint, like, and infrastructure, there's just so much support and accessibility and resources, more so there than there are in other states, for sure, specifically Texas. Like, in comparison, it's like Texas is a desert in terms of like, just, it's very limited and it's very stifling. However, and then we have that issue where we had the special education cap that was set by TEA, where it was like, we are only allowed to identify so many kids in the system. And they got slapped with a correction action plan from the Department of Ed. And then that's one of those things again, too, that, well, then when that cap got released, of course, the floodgates opened and all these kids were identified, but they didn't increase the funding. Mm-hmm. And that's still the same problem here. Okay, well, now you have now created a mandate to identify kids with dyslexia. And that is now, it's now putting way more weight on the system without increasing funding and increasing resources that you now know would be required. So it's interesting to hear in other states that why they have those, they've have some improvements where Texas doesn't have that. There's still areas that they're still trying to stifle parents or families or kids and individuals from being identified because they're trying to control the cost that is associated with it.
And with my oldest son, he was going to therapy, and that was when autism was reintroduced to our family, and his therapist said, you are probably, that was when they were using that term.
AU or Asperger's?
Asperger's, yeah. She said, you probably have Asperger's. And so he went to Kaiser to be tested, and they refused to test him because he was over 18. So, he's never officially been diagnosed, but so many things about his childhood started making sense after the therapist suggested that. So it has been very beneficial for him, and he's extremely high functioning. However, there are still some, quirks that he has that prevent him as an adult who's now 30 from living a life to the fullest because he's never been able to work through getting, some skill training.
Right. He was never provided the supports and resources he would have needed that would have propelled him and bolstered his success. That is a huge thing that because out of our kids too, and it sounds like he's gifted too.
Yes,
right?
He was very highly gifted. He started reading by age 5, which, is the opposite of my other 3 children who all have dyslexia. But by the time he was 8, he was reading. 4
kids.
Yeah.
You don't look like you have a 30-year-old, so take that compliment as you will. So that's amazing. That's a common problem especially with our kids that are gifted. They'll say, oh, but they're doing so well here, so why not? Why do we need to identify? Well, because they could actually even be doing better. So in a case where it's like, we have a kid, well, he's top 10% of his class. Yeah, but he could be 1% if we actually gave him what he needed.
Or
Think
like
about
in
that.
my son's situation, his social skills never fully developed. Academically, yeah, he was in the top 10% at our very affluent school. He could have gone to another school and would have been the top 2%. But socially, he never developed. And they offered to let him be skipped. And thank goodness we didn't skip him when he was in second grade, because that would have set him back even farther socially. But we didn't even know back then that, he was delayed socially.
Right. They get classified as like, oh, he's just a quirky kid.
Or he's a geek. Or
a geek, right. And it's just
awkward. And
right. And that's really, really hard without, you are different and you can't figure out why. Does he express what it feels like or what it felt like for him?
Not really, but he will talk about, like, he'll tell me things that I do because he reads about it now, right? So he'll tell me things that I do that are like spectrumy. I forget what he calls it.
Little tisms.
Tisms, yes. That's what he says. Oh, that's very tism, Mom. I'm like, oh, okay. That's how I'm discovering, my quirks are that. And my uncle, who just passed away, he was very antisocial and just kept to himself. And I'm sure he was on the spectrum. I'm sure he had dyslexia. My mother got more help than my uncle. And she's like, I don't know why they gave me more help than they did my brother. And I said, well, probably because you were your father's favorite, that he, provided you more. My mom got sent away to boarding school at age 10 to remedy her dyslexia.
So I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. We have these two amazing private schools that specialize in specifically with kids with dyslexia. And of course, at that school, there's kids that have multiple comorbidities too, but their main overarching challenge is dyslexia. And they are phenomenal schools. They're not boarding schools per se, but there were these little niches of private schools that showed up. I think I would probably even go as far as there's charter schools too that specialize in that, and they do serve its purpose. But like you're saying, I've never heard that statistic. I know that disability in general, like special education, we actually should be operating at a 20% identification, like across the country, so the fact that why the national average somewhere weans between like 12 and 13% in identification of all kids under IDEA. But just alone, you're saying that 20% of the population is dyslexic.
That's what statistics. So 1 in 5. That's what dyslexia's big marketing thing is 1 in 5. 1 in 5 is a big number that has been shoved under the carpet, the rug.
Wow, that is a huge, huge number. But I feel affirmed as an adult who's struggled with it I still do. I still have to put certain things in place for myself for basic practical things in day-to-day life, because the expectation is there's presumed competency for you to be competent in these areas to function in your day-to-day life, of the basic things of just even money management. Like, just think about so much of your life is having financial literacy about your own life. How can you optimize that as an adult when you still struggle with certain things mathematically without giving, whether you've done up again, if most of these adults, like you were saying, like in your own family, either continue to suffer in silence or found different ways to cope with it, I guess, or they found a partner in their lives, I guess, that helped them, to do those pieces.
Yeah. My daughter married a lawyer. And so she's like, I don't need to write anything ever again. Because, he can write things for her. He can read things for her. But my other 3 kids, they're all single and men. And you're right, there's expectations. And I was just talking to my son yesterday about, I don't even know if I should say this out loud, but a person in our family, I said, is the smartest dumb person I know. And then we were talking about how, maybe he really is a lot brighter than any of us realize. And it's because of his auditory processing delay that makes him seem less intelligent. And my son said his youngest son is also like that. And two of my kids struggle with auditory processing, one being my oldest son, who's very intelligent. And I know, like, people can tell he's very intelligent, but if he's just in a short conversation with someone, that perhaps they can't, because he does process things a little slower. So like those kind of things. And in my world, I mean, I'm always telling people, oh, I'm dyslexic, so this and that. And I have employees that work for me. And so they're supposed to, catch when I make spelling errors and things like that. But right now I've been on a planning committee for my high school reunion, and I'm with all these normies, and it's different than the bubble I have built for myself as a self-employed person for the last 35 years.
That is so interesting to hear you say that, because it is, when you start to then you build your bubble around you. And I'm worried, I have this nice bubble around my son, but it is a fierce reminder the moment you step out of that bubble. Like the contrast can be very stark. Grammarly as an adult is my best friend. It was like the best thing I could have found, because I considered myself a good writer in terms from my expression. I could be very expressive, right? So a lot of people liked in that way, the way that I wrote. But where people struggled with my writing was, again, my grammar, or where my errors were. And it doesn't matter. You can't let me proofread my own work. And if I have to be left to proofread my own work, then I'm going to have to proofread it over a course of days, because there are things I'm just not going to see. My brain is going to think and swear that I see the word that actually should be there. Like, I'm reading it as it is there. I'm not reading as if I've omitted it. But in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, that totally says that. And then even if I picked it up, I'm like, oh gosh, I put that out in the world. The word completely is missing from there, and I never saw it. But in my head, I saw it. I think it was, so before I had my podcast with the 3 other women, I was on a podcast with another autism mom, and she was saying how she's dyslexic. And we were both joking that we both read the musical artist, The Weeknd, as it is spelled correctly, that it's Kend, but he puts Knd. So I know, until she even pointed that out, I was like, it totally is spelled the right way. And I'm like, no, she's like, no, it's not. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, of course it's not, because that's done on purpose. And with all of that stuff that's out there in the world, people with their own play on words, that probably makes things more, I don't know if it makes things more challenging for those of us that have these cognitive neurodivergence, because it's really stepping outside of the conventional way. And now you're, also trying to adapt to the new ways that people are doing things. And so I feel like it's an ever moving target, especially if you're going to be someone like yourself who provides services and support and resources for individuals, knowing that, trying to put things in place that are going to help those individuals identify and learn that and be able to see that. I don't know. I think because of the way the world is moving at such a fast pace, and it's changing at such a fast pace, do you feel overwhelmed by that concept? Do you feel like, I
feel relieved that I am at the end of my career and ready to be able to check out of the business world. How
do your kids feel?
I haven't really had a conversation with them, but career-wise, I'm a little nervous for them, and I have tried to take care of all of them and their careers probably more than I should. So, all my kids have worked for me at one point or another. Currently, my oldest son is working for me in my 2 businesses because him finding work just was not really something he could do. And I really encouraged him to get his bachelor's degree so that he could have that to be able to get work. But now getting jobs is so much harder. I mean, you need to fill out applications. I've got one kid who works at Starbucks, and he's looking to, this is going to be his 2nd year as a camp counselor. And he's been teaching since he was 17 years old. And he's an amazing teacher. And so as a camp counselor, I'm sure it's the same, but he hasn't filled out his job application yet. And I said, I would help him, but he's my one kid who he wants to do everything on his own. Mm-hmm. And so just at Easter, I said, did you fill out your application yet? And he said, no, the the director said, we'll just work it out together. So, like some of those things just make it so much harder to fit into this current world. What's that?
I feel like that they're moving more and more away from that, from those conventional ways. Everything is becoming AI or electronic. You're moving away from those paper submissions. And when you do things electronically, I guess you can have more of those AI supports. But the problem is there's no current guardrails on AI. So there's all kinds of things that people can do to manipulate things. And so people who are still doing things by conventional methods, I think, are doing it because they can feel like they can, like employers feel like they can trust the information that they're getting. So some of them haven't totally made that full leap but from a school standpoint, like even in pub ed, I mean, everything I do from check in and sign out, everything is done electronically now, so, and I don't know if sometimes it's a convenience or if it's actually inhibiting use of certain people's brains or motor functions or skills. But for those people that need that, that's actually offering and aiding support and convenience, which goes back to when we do things in our world and society that support those with any kind of disability, it actually improves the greater whole. We all benefit from it. And people don't realize that. Like, when I say people, like greater society doesn't realize that. Our institutions that make the rules and policies don't really see that. They don't see that full benefit, though they've been benefiting it from years. Like elevators and ramps and wheels on suitcases. All of those things were put in place to accommodate and to help support those with disabilities to make things accessible. But we all benefit from it. Mm-hmm. And so we move away from everything being handwritten. That's going to make things, for those that have certain cognitive disabilities, I feel like that's going to make it easier for them in the workforce eventually.
But the job interviewing part is hard on our autistic kids, right. those skills. Like my youngest son, he's gotten all his jobs through either my husband or my daughter, like giving him the connection. And every time we tried to like give him tips and pointers on how to do a job interview, he's like, oh, I know. But then he actually gets to the interview and, doesn't. Right. Like you got to make eye contact. You can't just say, yeah, I guess. And, you need to like sell yourself. And he was like, ugh. And I was like, well, if you sell yourself really well once, then you don't have to go to tons of interviews.
Exactly. And so there's quite a bit of, at least for our kids, we have the 18 plus programs here in our district, and that's not all district, even though by law, you keep kids in they qualify and are eligible to receive services through the age of 21 through IDEA. But not every school district has 18 plus programs or vocational or life skills programs that are helping our kids bolster those skills and obtain those skills. And that takes a lot of practice if they're going to do that. And again, if that's met by, I think it's a combination of a few things. And I've been doing because I'm a school board trustee, I belong also to regional groups of trustees and like statewide advocacy groups and stuff like that. A couple months ago, we had a panel from like workforce leaders, so that kids that are they're basically receiving our kids. So it's like we wanted to know what their experience was of our kids leaving the school system and going into the workforce. What are they seeing? What are they observing? What do they see the challenges are? What are the problems? And they did say that a lot of our kids, just in general, we're not even talking about whether the kids have neurodivergence or disabilities or none of that. It's just talking in general, saying that our kids lack the soft skills. They're not getting those soft skills that they need. They're not as developed professionally as kids once were, or the expectation was when they left. So there seems to be a generational divide for sure. There's also, I think, not acknowledged, but I heard some of them, and I was very impressed by this. And this was somebody who, by trade, is a plumber, has a plumbing business, and he actually helps and has implemented CTE programs for, which are curriculum trade-based educational classes for students that again, that they don't want to go to college or not, or even if they do, they can earn CTE credits and they can earn certifications and other professions and trades. So he's launched those things, and he was talking about how he's dealt with some of these challenges of where these kids didn't have these soft skills, and how he's adjusted his sales and how he's responded to them and what his expectations are and how he can help further develop them professionally. And so I think for me, what my takeaway was from that panel and that information is it's both sides. It's the education system needs to continue to work on helping our kids develop in this way. The other side is helping the professionals, the business leaders, also learn what they can do to help develop our kids more. It's just understanding where the world is at, what our kids are exposed to. Obviously social media and access to technology has changed the way our kids learn and understand the world. Mm-hmm. It's not the world we grew up in.
No.
But we, people our age, are the people who are the CEOs and the executives. We're running the businesses, and older. We're still functioning under certain systems that maybe haven't totally been antiquated fully with the way our kids are growing and developing. And so it was interesting to hear, and I was hopeful. So if more professionals can do that, and they can see and they can learn to maybe, and it's not saying you're lowering the bar. I don't think that is not, I want to be clear, that is not what I'm saying at all. But I think it's about being able to identify and seeing the genius in a potential worker or prospect or hire that you're going to have. But identifying where they still need that professional development, I think probably still is a requirement of those professions. Mm-hmm. It's kind of them having to adjust their sales, adjust their infrastructure. And that, I get it. It costs time. It costs money. It's behavioral change. But the world, like I had said initially in our conversation, is changing much at a faster pace and evolving at a faster pace than really we all can keep up with. And so we're all kind of learning a little bit trial by fire, maybe a little bit of reactivity, but because learning about, again, these disparities have existed way before where we are now. We're saying that 20% of the population is dyslexic. There's not an epidemic of a dyslexia. This is just a statistic that's of the human, this is the human brain. This is human biology. So we just have neglected to recognize it, and we need to do that better. And that's not just, it doesn't just stop and start in the education system. It's also, I feel like it has to continue lifelong, and it's finding, and I feel like it's a prominent discussion in the world of autism. You have employers and you have institutions that are now priding themselves in being either gaining certifications and hiring individuals who are on the autism spectrum and giving them those, whatever they need, whatever kind of supports and continued development that they need. Why they're instead of like completely saying, nope, we can't hire you because you don't meet certain social criteria and I think eye-to-eye is good. Obviously, I think that's important, but I don't think that for somebody who's an autistic individual, for my son, it's a compliancy goal that I threw out the door. And I said, in fact, if you're forcing him to make eye contact, you're actually shutting down, you can sometimes be shutting down his receptivity. There's sometimes where it's increasing his receptivity, but it's knowing how to gauge the difference of when it's working one way or another, but actually having to force it. And I also, you want to see non-compliance because you want to see that they're being autonomous beings. Autonomy is hugely important too. But so I think you're seeing more of that, and probably, I guess maybe because I'm so dialed into it, I'm seeing more of it, but obviously it's just not enough still. Mm-hmm. It's not the norm. It's not the status quo yet, but my hope and goal would be that it would be.
Well, and I've been watching movies or TV shows that take place in the past. And so it does make me aware that we have made a lot of progress over time. And I think our children's generations are going to evolve the world so much more because they are so much more accepting of different people. I mean, when we were kids, bullying in school was just par for the course, where now that's not accepted. And the same thing in the workforce, right? Or sexual harassment was just, as a woman, you knew, well, that's just what you have to deal with. But today, those things aren't acceptable. So there's definitely an evolution that is taking place. And so maybe by our grandchildren's time, it will, we'll see the prize from all the work that we have done
right
today.
And you have to keep that going.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't end. I mean, and they say in education all the time, like, the work is never finished. So that's true. But I think that definitely holds true in any lane of advocacy. And at any given point, and as we also have seen on the greater world scale, or in the national one specifically, is that some of those things that we did make strides on, that they slide back. We can make all these leaps forward, but setbacks are also always possible too. So you we can't take that progress that we've made for granted.
Right. Like
Roe versus Wade.
Right.
I mean, we're just talking about just losing so many rights. And I was also interesting, and I know we're, in the same vein of that kind of concept, that they were saying, like, a lot of things have become more socially acceptable by society, but yet our policies are backsliding. And so then all of a sudden, all of these things that were becoming socially more normalized or acceptable or status quo, well, now they're all in danger and vulnerable. Like our LGBTQ population, like, it's all of those people are now more vulnerable because those policies are changing in that backslide, even though the social norms are way more accepting and more the status quo. And that's the scary thing. So we just have to keep paying attention to it. It's so easy because advocacy is exhausting. Mm-hmm. And I tell people a lot, and I had to learn this myself. It's a slow walk. It's not this, sometimes you are making quantum leaps, but you have to have endurance for it because it's hard. And I've had to learn that myself with my kid, and especially with his diagnoses. Like, even I got sold the Kool-Aid that it was like, oh, he's going to do these concentrated therapies for X amount of years. And then, he'll either be fully autonomous or, no big deal. You will be able to concede with life or whatever your previous trajectory was. And that's not the case.
Thanks again, Jean, for a great conversation. I really hope the audience enjoys our conversation as much as I did. It was probably the best, just conversation I have had on my podcast. So thank you for being a part of it and sharing your personal experiences and your hopes.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much.
Okay.
I appreciate
Have a great
you.
Weekend.
You too. All right.
Bye.